The house looms in my memory, its image seared into my mind as vividly as the day we first pulled into the long, cracked driveway. I recall gripping the battered door handle of our rumbling station wagon, my 8-year-old nerves shattered from the jarring 2-day drive. The sight of the sagging Victorian structure startled me from my restless slumber. Our new home looked anything but welcoming behind the gloom of overgrown trees and dried underbrush. "We're here. Wake your sister. It's time to unload," my mother chirped with forced enthusiasm. Her smiling voice belied the dark circles under her eyes. My baby sister wailed as I shook her gently awake. We hesitantly climbed out and huddled together on the spongy lawn, damp from recent storms. I'll never forget the ominous shriek of rusted hinges when the wind blew the front door open slightly. The details mesmerized me. Its peeling paint, the mismatch of architectural influences. The left side boasted classic Victorian gables and trim, while the right side sported simpler, more modern finishes. Oddly angled windows interrupted the asymmetry with no seeming rhyme or reason. Two appeared boarded up with rotting plywood. Strands of ivy and roof gutters seemed to choke the exterior. The previous owners left behind a detached garage leaning heavily to one side. Behind the house, woods quickly engulfed what remained of the backyard along with a small, weather-ravaged tool shed. As we crossed the threshold into the greater unknown that day, there was no sense of homecoming or joy. Just a nameless dread intertwined with morbid curiosity about the secrets held within those decaying walls, the secrets that would come to shape my fragile reality. I still recall my first steps into the dusty interior of that imprisoned house. The odors assaulted me first: mold, wood rot, and a sickly sweet undercurrent reminiscent of decay. Our footsteps echoed across the scarred hardwood floors that peeked out from threadbare rugs. Cobwebs draped each corner, billowing in the drafts that found every crack in the aged plaster walls. The entry funneled directly into a claustrophobic parlor, empty, but for a moth-eaten couch left by the previous family. A bricked fireplace sat soot-stained and abrupt along the far wall, sans mantel. My sister coughed dramatically as I traced my fingers through the thick carpet of dust cloaking a lone side table. I glanced up. Remnants of wallpaper curled downward, revealing hints of insanity in bizarre sketches and disturbing stains beneath. My eyes darted to a narrow staircase that corkscrewed to the upper level. Shadows seemed gathered at the top, clustered thicker than strictly possible. Beyond this front room sprawled a maze of doorways and halls that defied all logic. Rooms connected randomly, some vast and echoing, others closet-sized with ominous locks. Walls often ended abruptly, causing disorientation. My parents insisted on keeping certain doors always sealed tight, their keys hidden. My skin prickled with curiosity, imagining what forbidden spaces lay beyond each barrier. The kitchen alone offered some modern refuge with its dingy linoleum and glinting appliances. My mother busied herself preparing packets of ramen noodles to appease our impatient, grumbling stomachs. She flinched each time the screen door creaked open, allowing unwelcome autumn winds inside. My eyes fixated on strange symbols carved along the molding behind her. Realization dawned that we now dwelled inside something far more unnatural than any average family home. In the weeks after moving into the Victorian home, a sense of unease permeated its very foundations. The house itself felt alive somehow. My sister and I learned to avoid certain floorboards that groaned angrily when stepped on. We raced up and down the staircase to avoid lingering in the path of unseen eyes. Gusts of wind often crashed through the halls, slamming doors and rattling window panes. It only ever lasted mere moments before fading as swiftly as it came. Late at night, scratching and knocking sounds emerged within the walls. My baby sister would cry as she crawled wordlessly into my bed, clutching her tattered blanket. Our bedroom always remained frigid, regardless of the multiple moth-eaten quilts our mother piled atop us. That bed would shake violently on blustery nights when hidden things seemed angered by our presence. We avoided gazing into dark corners or gaps under furniture, fearful of imagined movements in our periphery. Strange vibrations often woke us from fitful sleep. We learned not to discuss these midnight disturbances with our mother, who assured us it was just the old house settling. I knew better, even then. My father traveled frequently for work, leaving my mother alone attempting to homeschool us. We remained confined mostly to the upper landing, wandering only when necessity called. Emergency trips downstairs often revealed subtle changes to rooms. Walls opening differently, new stains marring the floor, windows that had not been boarded previously now featured plywood blinkers. It seemed the house shifted itself periodically, like the nonsensical maze failed to maintain any structural logic. We learned to mentally map our surroundings daily. Any small alterations signaled menacing developments. Something ancient dwelled there with us, an entity that watched and waited, toying maliciously with its new possessions. My childish curiosity soon surrendered to all-consuming dread that danger lurked behind every corner, inside every shadow. Our time spent in that home often felt more akin to imprisonment. I perch uncomfortably on a cold metal chair, the glare of a single dangling light bulb burning into my vision. The sparse interrogation room breathes down my neck, its sterile gray walls appearing to inch closer with each relentless question. Detective Collins repeats himself, patience waning. "Let's go through this one more time. We've got you on camera leaving the convenience store right before the clerk was murdered. Your fingerprints mark the gun. You've got no alibi." He slaps a file on the metal table that echoes through my skull. "I want to understand what could possibly drive someone like you to cold-blood killing. This profile says you come from an upstanding middle-class family. College grad. No record." I blink slowly, the truth perched precariously on my tongue, weighing the consequences of spilling my reality. But this overzealous investigator refuses to dance around the subject any longer. I sigh, relenting. "It's that house. Where I grew up, it changed me, altered my state of being on some fundamental level. You wouldn't understand." I shake my head bitterly, the nostalgic trauma flooding back. There was something very wrong happening in that godforsaken structure from the moment we crossed the threshold. My mind transports back across the years to my bizarre childhood home. I outline the details like recounting a grounded nightmare, one I've never been able to fully wake from. The investigator's smug expression softens slightly at the edges as I describe the shape-shifting rooms, how reality failed to operate predictably under that roof. Events that warped my fragile youth far beyond average. The things we experienced between those decaying walls. I explain haltingly how fear became such deafening background noise that by puberty, I hardly registered it anymore. How my parents must have made some Faustian bargain to afford the property, its secrets driving my mother to alcoholism, madness devouring her from within. Her violent outbursts, my father's fearful compliance in never speaking of the phenomena. Their disbelief when I reported nightly disturbances, refusing to validate my crumbling perceptions. The house only grew more cavernous. Lightning storms crashed windows open spontaneously, while snowdrifts piled fully to the second story some winters. Every twisted corridor stretched longer, more maze-like. Entire wings were boarded up permanently after noises emerged that caused sobbing panic attacks in my sister. It became impossible to map, interior dimensions failing any logical continuity. My parents eventually deemed homeschooling useless, forcing us back into the real world ill-equipped to function. We were mercilessly bullied, these perceived oddities amplified relentlessly by cruel peers. My parents blamed my social struggles on laziness, media consumption, selfish attitude. Their words still lacerate my heart. "After everything we've given you kids, we've provided a roof over your heads at least." At some point, my mind fractured. I began sleepwalking, finding myself outdoors, curled on the moldy back porch in the dead of night, once halfway downtown with no memory of leaving. My sister was institutionalized after a psychotic break. When I turned 17, I fled my dissolving reality, taking muted refuge on friends' couches through senior year. I still struggled to escape the cold psychological grip of 163 Entombed Lane, its warped presence infecting my dreams, clawing at my soul. The investigator's stare rings hollow now, his smug superiority eroded by palpable compassion. That place became my entire universe, I couldn't differentiate fantasy from fright anymore, I whisper. My voice crackles. After graduation, I spiraled hard. Night terrors, paranoia, strings of toxic jobs and relationships. Last week, when that armed cashier grinned arrogantly despite my begging for money to eat, I snapped. The panic attacks, the flashbacks flooded every vein until I couldn't breathe. Fight or flight consumed me absolutely. I meet the investigator's gaze fully as my twisted odyssey reaches its finale. The room falls deafeningly silent, save the buzzing neon light above. I feel the truth of years' worth of anguish burning from my fractured eyes. His face pales considerably before he mutters quietly, "So about this house." "Tell me more about this house." The investigator prods gently, breaking the tense silence. He slides me a styrofoam cup of bitter black coffee, which I cradle tightly, gathering fortitude. I trace the cracked interrogation table, suddenly feeling 6 years old again, helplessly trapped in that bedroom as malignant forces converged. Frequent nightmares persisted into my 30s, eventually forcing me to confront my demons. I had to return. I confess haltingly. That abandoned property drew me back last year when I learned it was slated for demolition. Some naive part of me hoped facing fears would grant closure for decades-old trauma imprinted on my psyche. The investigator nods. My tone quivers, describing the winter morning. I crossed that forbidden threshold again, seeking salvation. Time evaporated since our panicked exile. Nature had forcefully reclaimed the grounds. Ice slicked across the caving roof structure as I circled warily. A lone engraved raven sat sentry from within skeletal birch branches that tickled boarded windows. I scarce recognized the once proud Victorian facade now being swallowed into the earth. My heart raced, entering through an access point gouged by local teens. Dust quilted every surface, dancing tiny cyclones stirred by my breath. That forsaken place seemed to reject my presence, floorboards groaning angrily under each cautious step. I traced a finger over the mantel oddly installed across our kitchen sink. Interlocking triangles still etched faintly into the wood grain. Every darkened corner hid watchful eyes, the entire foundation creaking against Arctic winds. And suddenly there before me, the one forbidden sight I most craved, that narrow hallway behind the cellar door my father forever kept padlocked. I spotted his forgotten keyring tangled in cobwebs atop the useless refrigerator. With trembling hands, I inserted the anchor key into the warped door, shuddering on rusty hinges. Gaps immediately breathing musty air over me as decades of dust and secrets spilled forth. Flashlight raised, I descended slowly. The constricted passage seemed to pulse and contract in waves, trying to expel me. Stone walls wept icy rivulets that soaked my coat. Dozens of tiny shoe prints dotted the muddy earth underfoot. Rounding a tight bend, the feeble light finally illuminated the grisly sight, my repressed memories flooding back. A large chamber stretched before me with handprints smearing every surface. Intricate symbols glowed ominously across both walls and dirt floor, which was littered with small skeletal remains. A glowing emerald amulet dangled from one grotesque carving, part of a disturbing altar erected before me. Sudden, searing pain knifed through my skull at the nightmarish revelation. Screaming, I desperately fled toward the waning daylight as the whole cursed structure seemed poised to swallow me into its depths. I exhale sharply, lungs aching. The investigator studies his folded hands, my account apparently aligning with details of their investigation. 6 local children reported missing in 1960s to 70s. Case gone cold until contractors found. His radio crackles. My childhood home will soon be obliterated as search teams scour the scene. I smile faintly, knowing the burial grounds have finally released their sinister secret. The lead detective's eyes radiate validation as we sit in unified silence. I feel seen. My choices contextualized, if not forgiven. Weight lifts from my spirit. Freedom nears. The house's grasp over me fades amongst purifying spring light dawning across my soul.